Okay, well, good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone today to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate for the workshop on the role of development finance institutions and the Canadian development context. My name is Steve Mason. I'm the Director of Programs at Aga Khan Foundation Canada. We are webcasting the first part of this day, so I would like to welcome the online audience who has joined us for the opening session. When this building was opened in 2008 by His Highness the Aga Khan and Prime Minister Harper, they expressed an ambition for it to be used as a space for the exchange of ideas, collaboration, and reflection on Canada's role in the world. As part of this mission, we regularly convene events on a range of pertinent topics. Today's event marks the first in a series that AKFC will host on the subject of emerging economies and the changing international development landscape. It builds on a series of events held over the last 2 years on the subject of innovative financing for development. Through that series, we had the chance to pursue informative discussions on the subjects of new approaches to microfinance, community philanthropy, and innovative financing models for early childhood development. The topic we are examining today is one that is of high relevance to all of us who are working in the international development sector. Finding creative, responsive approaches to underwriting the role of the private sector in developing countries has been an underlying premise of the Aga Khan Development Network for over half a century. Throughout this time period, the AKDN has worked with a number of bilateral and multilateral DFIs to support the development of the for-profit, but also, and importantly, the not-for-profit private sector in both Africa and Asia. Our experience working with DFIs in a diversity of contexts has demonstrated the crucial role that they can play in supporting priority international development efforts, while also highlighting some of the key gaps in the sector. With the possibility of creating its own DFI and the recent appointment of Minister Paradis as chair of the OECD's Redesigning Development Finance Initiative, Canada is now poised to significantly increase its contribution to the development finance sector. It is our hope that the experts gathered here today, from government, civil society, the private sector, and academia, can help inform this contribution. We will be looking at a number of core issues that Canada should consider as it moves more concertedly into the development finance arena, including the appropriate role of a DFI, the challenges and opportunities for development finance to have an impact on poverty reduction, and how Canada's contribution to this field can be both unique and distinctive. We are very fortunate to have 4 specialists in the field to kick off our discussions today. These individuals have significant experience working with and researching development finance institutions from both the Canadian and international perspectives. I would like to first introduce Kareem Harji, who will be moderating the opening panel. Kareem is co-founder and partner at Purpose Capital, an impact investment advisory firm that mobilizes all forms of capital, financial, human, and social, to accelerate social progress. Kareem is a senior research associate at the Centre for Community Innovation at Carleton University and teaches social entrepreneurship at the University of Toronto. Kareem will be moderating a panel with 3 panelists. We have Brett House, Gerhard Priest, and Linda Jones. Brett is a senior fellow both with CG and the Sauvé Foundation. Brett's research focuses on the links between trade policy and macroeconomic performance, the rise of emerging markets and its implications for G10 economies, frameworks for sovereign debt restructuring, and the theory and practice of impact investing. Gerhard Priest is founder and CEO of Sorona Asset Management Incorporated, formerly known as Meta Investments Incorporated. In over 20 years of frontier market investing, Gerhard has been a founder of a number of firms and funds, including Sorona, Microvest Capital Management, Microcap Capital, and the Latin American Challenge Investment Fund. And last but not least, we have Dr. Linda Jones. Linda is the Director of SME Investment and Investment at Meta and an international expert in the field of inclusive private sector development. Linda has extensive strategy and implementation experience across Asia and Africa through long-term positions and consulting assignments for implementing agencies, multilateral organizations, and private sector entities. The Aga Khan Foundation was very fortunate to have Linda as our Global Director of Market Development for a number of years. We will have an opportunity after the webcast to do a full introduction of everyone in the room. Before I pass the mic over to Kareem, I want to remind our audience tuning in on the webcast that there will be a Q&A session immediately following the presentations. And you are welcome to submit questions either via our AKFC Twitter handle, which is @AKF Canada, or through the webcast port. Thank you very much, and I'll ask Kareem to come up to moderate the first session.
So thanks for that introduction, Steve, and welcome everyone both in the room as well as online. We're glad you could join us for, I think, is a very timely topic for many of us. Clearly, the development landscape, both in Canada as well as outside, is changing. And it's changing in ways that are quite different from maybe what we've seen in the past. And so not only is this a timely discussion, but it's one that needs to be had, I think, in a way that embraces a range of different approaches, voices, and perspectives around how we move forward in this area. So I'd like to thank AKFC for hosting this and hosting us in this beautiful building. And when we think about international development, we know that the needs, whatever part of the world virtually you're in, continue to increase. They continue to deepen in terms of some of the challenges that we're facing, and we know that we have to broaden the range of tools in our toolbox. And the role of a DFI can be quite substantive, complementary, and engaged as we think about the range of tools that we're considering. And so when we think particularly about the role of the private sector in international development, looking at it as a complementary role to a lot of the other approaches we're currently deploying, I think are one of the ways we should think about this. How can DFIs and the activity that we all are bringing to the table be additive to what we are doing already? And so when we think about how we enable positive social and economic change, how we can make it more sustainable, I think that some of the questions we're going to address in the next little while will be important to make sure we get right. And so today we're going to hear from 3 speakers. We'll provide about 10 minutes each, reflecting on their respective experience in international development. Brett is going to talk about some of the considerations in creating a Canadian DFI. Gerhard is going to talk about Sorona's experience, which, again, one of the leading groups in this space around what we can learn from that experience. And Linda is going to talk about this nexus of investment and development. What are some of the real issues that we have to consider and make sure we understand. When we think about blended finance, I think it is important to consider this isn't about either or. We're looking around how we combine different forms of capital, different forms of capacity building, how we measure impact in ways that actually contribute to a net gain, increasing the size of the pie around what we're trying to achieve here. And so I think as we get into the discussion, I'll look to pull out areas that we should prioritize, consider some of the tensions we have to address head on, and making sure that those are articulated clearly to inform the policy and program discussion moving forward. I'm going to introduce Brett now, just to come up to the stage and begin his presentation. After the 3 presentations, I'll moderate some of the questions that we'll have from the room as well as online. Brett.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and also thank you again to the Foundation for hosting and convening this meeting today. I think the most important aspect of this conversation is the role it can play in bringing together a broad-based coalition to move forward on the idea of a development finance institution. As many of you know, it's a topic that we've covered many times over the last 5 or 6 decades. The idea was first proposed in the early 70s under one of the Trudeau governments, and we've yet to see the idea come to fruition, and I think the broad coalition of people around this table today will be one of the key building blocks in putting this together. I do want to recognize the fantastic collaboration I've had personally from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Cam Vidler, Sam Burton, and Engineers Without Borders in bringing together both the business community earlier this year and the NGO community on this issue, and I'm very pleased to see the conversation broadening even further. So to kick off, I thought we should think about some context before going into the specific considerations for a Canadian DFI. As all of you know, we are the only G7 country that does not have a development finance institution, and even more than this, we are one of the few G7 countries that has frozen ODA, over official development assistance, since 2010. At the same time, we've seen massive poverty reduction happening principally in middle-income countries, and as has been the case at the World Bank for over 20 years, the need to rethink how we engage with middle-income countries and the kind of financing we provide to support poverty reduction in those countries, while at the same time considering how we can focus our ODA dollars more effectively in low-income countries has just become more and more acute. In starting a conversation about a DFI or a DFM, if it's a mechanism located within another institution, I think one of the key things we have to identify up front, and I should apologize in advance, my slides are a little text heavy, but they will be circulated after, are meant to be as much a presentational tool as notes for you after this presentation. So first off, the principal consideration I think we need to consider is what market failure are we trying to address? And that has to be the core of our proposal for any development finance institution. If there's no market failure, then we don't need a DFI. But I think we can provide a number of case studies, a number of situations, a number of theoretical propositions for why a DFI will be a helpful addition to our quiver in development finance. We have to be able to show, though, where those are and how Canada can provide a distinctive contribution to resolving them. When we're talking about development finance, we are talking about commercial finance. We're not talking about grants, and we're not talking about strictly concessional finance. And I think that's important as a distinction to make, because we need to draw a fine line between a DFI's financing and financing we're already providing under grants and concessional assistance as part of our ODA package. We are not duplicating with the DFI, we are adding to the range in our toolkit. The second issue I think we need to confront early on too is a sense of scale and how a DFI will contribute. We are looking at catalytic financing that will crowd in additional private sector financing. This is very much the model of the other DFIs and the global DFI, the IFC. And we should not be looking to a Canadian DFI to finance projects in toto, but rather providing the initial seed funding that is going to bring in additional investors both in Canada and abroad. To do so, I should note that I think a DFI needs to look at the full range of financial instruments, all the way from loans and guarantees to actual equity positions. We have to ensure, thirdly, that whatever institutional design that we pursue, that it matches the purpose and the market failure we're trying to address. We need staff that have the financial skills that are required in order to carry out a DFI's function, and we need a clear and independent balance sheet so that costs and returns are clearly matched to one another and not buried in broader government finances. Lastly, I think we need an appropriate risk profile and clarity on what that looks like. This needs to be a risk-loving institution. Consistently, when we look at lessons, and that's the great thing about being the late mover on this issue, we can not only learn from and build on the lessons of other DFIs, we can go vastly beyond them, and I'm sure some of the speakers today, particularly from the impact community, will underscore that point. When we look at the lessons from other DFIs, we see their risk-loving nature shrink over time rather than expanding. We see them generally become more inhibited in terms of taking, the first tranche on risk rather than going boldly forward, and moving into new sectors. We need to ensure that the mandate for this DFI, the board or other governance structure that surrounds it, is truly tipped to preserve a risk-loving approach over time. I do think these concerns mean that amongst the panoply of institutional options between a standalone Crown Corporation, incorporating this as a subsidiary in other existing Crown Corporations, creating a special unit in a department, either a standalone or a subsidiary within a Crown Corporation appears to me to make the most sense when we look at the lessons from other countries. Who it reports to and how it refers back to Parliament, I think, is a matter that could be referred for discussion, but that's also something that we would need to be clear on. But I want to emphasize, these are broad concerns that we should be thinking about. Rather than getting into the plumbing today, Let's stay at a bit of 30,000 feet and ensure we get clarity at that level before getting too deep on any one of these individual questions. One of the things that gets debated often in discussion around development finance mechanisms is the extent to which they should be Canadian preferenced or limited only to engagement with Canadian corporations. What we see from the most successful DFIs is that they have no national content or nationality restrictions. They're free to work with the best ideas, the best companies, and the best projects wherever they are in the world. That's not just to ensure that we get the best returns here, but that we also get the best double and triple bottom line outcomes in terms of environmental sustainability, human sustainability in the projects that we engage in. I think it's also critical to the optics around this proposal. We need to ensure that this is not another way of providing old ideas of industrial policy or corporate welfare in a new guise. This needs to be truly market-driven, but focused on de-risking to make market transactions work better. Sorry, this is not coming out nearly as large as I hoped it would be. I bet online is actually able to see this better than you are. These are some comparative metrics on the other G7 DFIs. And the point of this slide is threefold. One is to show that the capital base underneath existing DFIs varies incredibly broadly, to the point that I would say the underlying capital base is almost irrelevant. If you empower a DFI to raise debt on capital markets, leveraging Canada's AAA credit rating on an annual basis, the underlying capital base need be no more than a guarantee from the federal government to cover those debts. What this table also tries to highlight is relative scale. At a minimum, if you look at the other DFIs in the G7 and measure their annual portfolio commitments against either private capital flows to developing countries from those G7 nations or the size of their individual GDPs, it implies an annual portfolio commitment of at least $350 to $500 million. I think most of us are hoping this will go to a larger scale than that, but I think that provides us a sense of at least a floor on the kind of ambition we should be thinking about. In looking at a DFI, it's not only politically astute, I think, to ensure that we're clear on how it's distinct and its financing is different from ODA, but I think institutionally we need to be clear on what ODA does versus quasi-commercial development financing. They should be additive to one another and not a substitute. A DFI or DFM should be engaged in work with enterprises, either profit or not-for-profit, but in financing projects that do produce a yield, that do produce a return for the risks that they've taken. If we're going to move ahead on a DFI, I think one of the critical coalition building measures we need to take is to ensure that it's co-initiated with an unfreezing of ODA and a commitment to increase ODA on at least an inflationary basis. Otherwise, we will always run the risk of the accusation that this is somehow substitutive for ODA. And given that ODA finances public goods that a DFI may not or is likely not to finance, the two should be seen as completely complementary to one another. Commercial development finance, or even quasi-commercial development finance, should allow us to sharpen our focus and impact in developing countries. And here I want to make a clear distinction between emerging or middle-income countries and very low-income countries. When we look at our countries of focus for DFAT-D right now, we still have many, I would argue far too many, middle-income countries, countries that have access to capital markets within the realm of our countries of focus. These are the countries that, in my view, should fall underneath the purview of support from a DFI or DFM, and they should be replaced here by other very low-income countries that not only don't have access to capital markets, but frankly shouldn't. Our lesson from the HIPC initiative and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative around the turn of the millennium was that even highly concessional grants and loans at 0.05% from the World Bank and other regional development banks are too expensive for low-income countries. Even though loans from the International Development Association of the World Bank were given for decades at 0.75%, those proved unsustainable for most low-income countries in the world. We've started relending to them again, And on the IMF's debt indicators, we already see over half of the HIPC countries in extreme debt distress, and the other half are in moderate to high debt distress. So the lesson there is that, DFI financing could be provided to enterprises working in low-income countries, but what we need to do at the same time is ensure that our ODA is entirely focused on low-income countries. That isn't to say Ukraine, Colombia, or Ghana are not worthy of our support, but they're worthy of different support. They're worthy of support where we engage with business to reduce poverty, generate growth, and create jobs. And if a country like Colombia is not spending enough on reducing poverty for the poorest of the poor, essentially that's a domestic political failure that we shouldn't be solving for them. Whose skin should be in the game is one of the questions that comes up when we talk about a DFI. And here, there are a number of financing arrangements when you look across the panoply of DFIs that are out there. I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind in the current budget environment in Canada is that this needs to be more or less budget neutral. I think we're unlikely to move forward on a proposal coming to fruition unless we can make it as budget surplus friendly as possible. And I think that's entirely possible to do, not just because we have a great reputation internationally in finance, but also because it makes a great deal of sense when you look at the best case scenario or the best lessons from other DFIs. If you look at Germany's KfW, they are a massive issuer in international financial markets. They've helped create yield curves in local markets where they've issued, and they've also become a key portfolio feature in many asset managers' mix of fixed income instruments. A DFI in Canada could be empowered to issue leveraging our AAA credit rating and generating capital on an annual basis that's redeployed in private finance. Essentially, if we think private finance is a good idea for Canada to de-risk, let's ask private financial sources to actually fund it. There is no reason this needs to come out of general government revenue. And indeed, because it would be collateralized against lending that expects a return, it would have essentially almost no impact on net debt. How many bottom lines should we be thinking about? I know many of you come from the impact space, and so one of the things that you'll likely speak to today is environmental, labor standards, other ways of measuring impact beyond the fiduciary. I would suggest, though, that in order to move forward on this proposal, I think we need to be primarily concerned with fiduciary to show that it will be a profitable enterprise, as all other G7 DFIs are, but we do need to incorporate impact or notions of social finance into its design. This is where we can move substantially beyond the lessons of the other DFIs out there. Few of them actually do incorporate explicit double or triple bottom line measures in their mandate. This is something we can do from an outset, and I think where we have the possibility to break truly new ground. How do we make this happen? Well, as I alluded to at the beginning, I think we need to ensure that as we move forward, we can reflect both to government and to all of our constituencies a sense of broad public support that cuts across party lines. With Engineers Without Borders, we organized a day on Parliament Hill on June 2nd. Earlier this year, we saw 60 MPs. We had 60 MPs voice their support for this idea. We have yet to hear any MP say that it's a bad idea. Of course, many have reservations, many want to see the details, but I think we have an open door in many places for the concept of a DFI. I think we also need to ensure, because this has been something that's discussed for 40 years, that rather than doing something quick and dirty, we continue to deliberate and get it right, even at the cost of a bit of delay, because we're really talking about something with a very long-term perspective. So in order to help build that broad coalition, Engineers Without Borders has launched a campaign, Fix the Gap, fill the hole in the Canadian development finance landscape by creating a DFI. I would encourage all of you to reach out to your constituencies as we go forward from today to ensure that this isn't just a conversation in this room, but one that gets extended, that brings in more ideas and ensures that not only do we learn from the lessons of other DFIs, but we make this truly Canadian and truly distinctive in going beyond those templates taking account of these considerations and ensuring that this is a credible institution that increases Canada's development impact, leverages our diaspora communities, leverages our expertise, and ensures we not only do good, but we make money in the process of doing good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brett. I wonder if I should start by declaring that I don't think we should build a DFI, that ship left the port 30 years ago, would have been a good idea then, but we shouldn't try to swim after it. But maybe I won't start by saying that. I'll keep you guessing. Development finance. I'll talk more broadly about development finance, and the question is, should Canada go there, and if so, how? And like Brett, I agree, it's really a question of philosophy. What should the public sector be doing, and what should the private sector be responsible for? And also a question of practicality, what needs to get done today? 10 years ago, after having built a number of private investment funds, including in microfinance, I recall being involved in a number of microfinance loans, or loans to microfinance banks in Latin America, and being squeezed out by the IFC, because IFC's cost of capital was a whole lot lower than mine was. Was I angry? Yep, I was quite angry. And over the last 20 years, or 20-some years of structuring private equity and private debt in developing countries around the world, there have been numerous times where I've been frustrated with the acts or the actions of development finance institutions around the world. But I have to say I've also grown to admire them more recently when they do what they're designed to do. 20 years ago, or 20-some years ago, when I started in this work, there were no private equity firms in emerging and frontier markets around the world. Not India, not Brazil, or certainly not any of the frontier countries. And it was about 18, 20 years ago that some young people that had come to school in US and Europe and were working in the investment banks and the private equity houses and the corporates began going back home to their countries and launching private equity funds. That was about 18, 20 years ago. And the first capital that came into there, and still the primary source of capital, is from the multilaterals and the national development finance institutions. And so they went where private sector capital was did not dare to go at that time. And I'd venture that without the DFIs at that time, there would be no private equity industry in emerging markets today, at least not for the small to mid-market companies. So it was the DFIs that created private equity in those markets. The question then for me is, what is the role of the public sector versus the private sector? I believe it's to close the gap, similar to what Brett already said. In Economics 101, we learned that the three factors of production are land, labor, capital. And we learned from Adam Smith that where there is demand, there is supply. And microfinance is a classic example of where there was demand. A lot of micro-entrepreneurs, a lot of poor people expressed demand for credit, and the commercial bank said, sorry, we can't give it to you. We're not going to supply that. It's too risky. It's too expensive. We can't do it. And so it was the NGOs that held the hands of the entrepreneurs, the micro-entrepreneurs, marched them into banks, says, you've got to do this. They said no. And the public sector, the private donors in the public sector came on board and said, we will help you close that gap to prove that the poor are bankable. Indeed, the public sector wisely chose not to stand in that supply-demand gap forever. They chose to help the private sector close that gap. And if they do right by their philosophical beliefs, they ought to be leaving that space now, because the private sector is there and is indeed serving the small to mid-market and the micro-entrepreneurs around the world. So philosophically, we believe that in as much as is possible, the private sector ought to be supplying the demands of the market in developing countries as they do here. How does one close that gap? In the case of development finance, it's by holding the hand of the private investors. The private investors have been afraid of emerging markets. We represent private capital mostly from developed markets going into developing markets. And for the most part, private capital is afraid to go there. but less so today than before. More and more private capital markets are reading about the growth story, the rising middle class in many of these countries, in most of these countries, perhaps in almost all of these countries, and is increasingly notionally interested in investing in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. But darn, Africa's a far place. It's far away from here, and who knows what the risks are there? Will I ever get my capital back? They're notionally interested, they're afraid. And for 20 years, we've been talking to bureaucrats and politicians in Europe and North America saying, what we need is for you to hold the hand of the private capital as we take it to Africa. What we need is for you to enhance the risk-adjusted rate of return for private investors. They want to do it, but they're afraid. And once they experience it, they will be there for the long run. So for a transitionary period, we need you to hold the hand of private capital as it goes to those markets. Which brings me to my experience with the Canadian government, which I was asked to touch on here. 20 years ago, I sat in a room at CEDA and suggested to them that we would be building a microfinance bank in a country, I don't recall which one, and we would like them to lend us the money, not give us the capital to get it started. And we would pay it back. I was driven out of town. There was hostility in the room when they understood that we actually wanted to take capital into Africa and take it back. There was like literal hostility in the room. I decided that was not a safe place to go. But 15 years ago, 5 years later, DFATE, Foreign Affairs and Trade, invited me to a group of their policy people, and they were pondering the question, what if they would invest in developing country markets? And they suggested, so we had a good discussion, they wanted leverage, so they wanted to put in $1, and we were to raise $9 of private capital and would make 10, and that'd be great. But they wanted to do it on a pari passu basis. And I said, if I can raise 9, I don't need your 1. Really, I don't. It's only if your 1 is going to motivate the 9 to come to the table that it'll make a difference. I don't need your 1. So that didn't work. 8 years ago, I tried the political angle, and then there was a change of government. And I said, never doing this again. We have, throughout our years, worked almost exclusively with private capital. I raised one fund funded by primarily DFIs about, I think, 15 or 17 years ago, and it was very frustrating. It wasn't worth the gray hairs that I achieved during that period of time. And so our commitment has been to work with private sector capital exclusively. Until 3 years ago, I was in Geneva at a private equity conference, and a friend from Ottawa called and said, there's a new wind blowing through town here. You ought to come and talk. And I said, you know I'm not going there. I'm not coming back. And he begged, and I said, listen, you can go check it out on my behalf. I'm not paying you, but I'm not interested. I ate my words, and eventually we actually struck an agreement with OPIC in the United States and with the Canadian government, wherein first we had an $87 million commitment from OPIC, and when I stepped into CEDA at the time with Kerry Max across the table from me, Kerry and David, I think it was, and David Morrison. They said, what do you want? I said, well, we're a Canadian firm. We've got an $87 million commitment from OPIC. You ought to be embarrassed. David said, what do you want? I said, $100 million from the Canadian government as an investment. He said, we can't do that. We're maxed at 20, and we can't make investments. So we eventually structured something whereby CEDA or DFAT-D made a contribution to an NGO, to MEDA, which invested then into one of our funds on concessionary terms. And that's actually been very interesting. It actually was a response or an appropriate answer to my plea for the last 15, 20 years to various governments that they hold the hand of private investors. For 15, 20 years, that plea fell on deaf ears. And this time, it actually worked. And it's been fascinating for me to see that in 2 years, 2 or 3 years, Canada has moved from being virtually absent in the development finance space to being seen as a leader, an innovator. It's taken me by a whole lot of surprise. I had not expected that. But there's a new understanding within the Government of Canada, within DFAT-D, and I believe the marriage of CEDA and DFAT is a great marriage. The interplay between foreign affairs, trade, and development makes a whole lot of sense to me. And so what I've witnessed in the last 2-3 years is that Canada has leapt from being absent to being at the forefront of innovation. A classic DFI may have been helpful 20, 30 years ago, but I believe that horse has left the barn and may no longer be needed. I'm talking about a classic DFI, and I think Brett was talking about a slightly non-classic DFI with somewhat different focus. So where does that leave us vis-a-vis Canadian development finance? I think there's one principle that I would that I think we need to follow, and that is catalytic. Whatever it is, whether it's repayables contributions, whether it's guarantee mechanism, whether it's a DFI, I don't know how you structure these things. Whatever it is, it has to catalyze. There is a lot of private sector capital out there. We don't need DFIs to be competing with private capital. No need for that. There's a lot of private capital out there. The public sector is there to catalyze the private sector to close the gap where there is demand in the economy and there is not supply. So it has to catalyze. It has to crowd in, not crowd out private sector capital. A few weeks ago in New York, the head of IFC Asset Management told me that they would be replicating the fund we just built in order to compete with us. Where in your world does that make sense? The private capital is now there. For 20 years we asked you to hold our hands, and you wouldn't do it. Now the private sector capital is finally there, and you want us to come and compete with us? To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Blended finance, the new buzzword around the Canadian Development Minister's work. Blended finance to catalyze private capital makes a lot of sense. Don't pick winners on the ground, but work through intermediaries, catalyze their work. Partner with and catalyze Canadian players. There are Canadian players, not enough of them. I hope there will be more. It's a lonely field here in Canada, but partner with and build up more Canadian players. You can get a much, much, much bigger bang for the buck and for the Canadian brand around the world by catalyzing private capital, catalyzing Canadian players, as opposed to coming in with a DFI. There's no shame in building up Canadian industry at the same time. And then there's a few technical things. Be efficient, be light touch, take risks. Above all, be courageous. So the marriage of DFATE and CETA, I think, at least philosophically, has been wonderful. For many years, I felt us as Canadians seeping away from the international development, the development finance space. We've come back, we're coming back, and we're coming back, being recognized in many places now as suddenly innovative. And so I say I again feel hope that we as Canadians have a place at the table. If I was to write a book, you know those dummy books, PCs for dummies, I need a BlackBerry for dummies. I would write a book. It's about the economy, dummy. And I think we as Canadians have finally figured that one out. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Linda Jones, and I'm here speaking on behalf largely of the not-for-profit sector. And before the private sector people hear your eyes glaze over, I just want to tell you about the organization which I'm representing here today, and that's MEDA. MEDA was formed over 60 years ago as an investment club, MEDA's Mennonite Economic Development Associates. We didn't become an NGO until the 80s when there was lots of grant money on the table that would enhance our programming. But we are essentially an NGO that has commercial interests, business solutions in our DNA, and that's how we've always done our programming, even before it was popular. I'm also, to some extent, representing a new group that's been formed, the Canadian Forum for International and Investment and Development. Kareem Harji, Stephen Nairn of Lundin Foundation, and myself spearheaded this group, and we've started to have meetings, and I've been collecting feedback from that group on a DFI, and this, what we hear here today, will also feed back into that, and we will be preparing a brief for the minister with our thoughts on a DFI. So speaking from that perspective then, I think I'd like to start talking first about economic growth versus development outcomes. So let's think about that. If there are more jobs as a result of investment, what does that mean? Well, it can mean different things. Are they decent jobs in terms of the ILO language? Are they concerned with worker health and safety? Do they offer a living wage? Are there job opportunities for women and youth, et cetera? So that would be one question about economic growth versus development outcome. I think they go hand in hand, but there are other questions as well. For example, if we look at investment and resulting increases in GDP, country is getting richer, might be a middle-income country, but what GDP does not show us is the disparity in many of those countries. Some of the poorest people live in middle-income countries. GDP is just the average of the incomes. So can investments be made in a way that reduce disparity rather than increase disparity? And I'll address that question in a moment. Then there's the whole issue about, if we invest in formal businesses, that will increase the local tax base because there'll be taxpayers. And I think that's true and that's good. But we know that in the local tax base, there can be a lot of leakage due to corruption, there may not be redistribution, that benefits will go more to the have neighborhoods and facilities than to the have-not neighborhoods and facilities. So these are just some examples of things we need to think about when we think about investment and when we think about development investment made by our Canadian DFI. Having said that, MEDA's a believer in investment. I'm very proud to say we spun off Serona. Serona and Gerhardt used to be part of MEDA, and they grew out of MEDA. So great achievement in MEDA's foresight to have hired Gerhardt and got the whole investment ball rolling there. We also are founders of Microvest, which Gerhardt was alluding to. So we do believe in investment, and we actually have our own internal risk capital fund that we use alongside our programs, within our programs, and in other strategic ways. But we also believe that investment can be made in a way that is positive for development outcomes. If investment is considered, if due diligence is thorough, if financial returns are not the only thing that is measured, and we look at other factors such as environmental, social, and governance returns, which have been mentioned here this morning, we believe that is possible for a DFI and for commercial investors, and indeed we see it in Serona and the way they perform. So getting to the question then, what would be the role of a Canadian DFI? I agree with my colleagues, and I actually had written this because I was sure they would both say this, that a DFI should not crowd out private investment. Absolutely. A DFI should support private investment, it should be catalytic, and it should go where private investment can't go. But I also believe that this provides the DFI with a carrot and a stick. A carrot and a stick as a development finance institution to require development outcomes. Whether this is by forming a DFM, which is different from a traditional DFI, whether it's connected to ODA in some way, all of that is up for discussion. So what would our, and I say MEDA, CAFID Group, what would our expectations be of our Canadian Development Finance Institution? First of all, our Canadian DFI could support funds and investments in specific geographies, in underserved markets, in low-income countries, in countries with high disparity between the rich and the poor. Our DFI can require that investments catalyze investments in local funds and in local SMEs, either directly or indirectly through funds of funds, with the end result that they are building local economies. Our DFI may specifically work in certain sectors. For example, it may choose in some areas to work in the agricultural sector and be concerned about the suppliers to that sector, smallholder farmers rather than larger commercial farms. It might reward behaviors that successfully integrate marginalized populations, whether that's women, youth, indigenous peoples, and so on. It might seem like a tall order, but I seem to remember that affirmative action and job creation has worked here in Canada. I believe it can work elsewhere. I think our DFI should also expect funds and companies to be transparent, well-governed, and concerned about sustainable growth. and returns on the environment, social, and governance issues, so on and so on. But I think one of the most important things that our Canadian DFI needs to do is to make sure that it's measuring impact. What is the result of the investments that it is making? And it needs to report that to its Canadian constituents so we know where our development dollars are going. I believe all of this is possible, and I believe and hope that the DFI is moving in this direction. But in order to achieve this, it does require blended finance. It does require technical assistance funds alongside investment dollars. And again, whether that's through a DFM or collaboration with ODA. But in fact, IFC, for example, and many of the other DFIs do have technical assistance funds now because they have realized, and I've had very senior people at IFC and other DFIs tell me that, they have realized investment alone is not enough. It requires more to achieve development outcomes. So I'd just like to very briefly tell you about a program that the Canadian government has invested in that MEDA and Sirona are jointly implementing, which I think is a kind of a prototype, not the only model. There could be many other models, but I just want to show you how this works. So in June 2013, the Canadian government provided $20 million to MEDA, of which $15 million flowed through to Sirona as catalytic first loss investment, as Gerhard has described. And Gerhard has gone on just over the past year and now has a fund of $133 million. And there are stipulations around how that money can be invested. For example, 60% has to go to a list of lower income countries. Of that $133 million that Sirona has fundraised, $71 million has already been invested in 13 countries. And in 2013, the SMEs, which those funds have invested in, and this is cumulative, so I'm not trying to create attribution issues here, but in 2013, those businesses contributed $30 million in tax to local economies. New jobs created in 2013 were 3,700, and 14 million consumers received products from sustainable companies. And if you know Gerhard, he'll talk about their commercial returns, but if you ask him about the due diligence process they go through to ensure that companies are going to be responsible and ethical and have environmental and social returns, it's all part of the package. In addition to this, $5 million was stayed with MEDA for technical assistance, where we are supporting fund managers and we are supporting SMEs. We've set up a mentorship program, and we've recruited Canadian financial experts to be mentors to funds in developing countries. We have 7 Canadian mentors trained, and that program has been launched and will continue for the full 5 years of the program, with additional mentors coming on board. We have launched we've changed the name, a Sustainable Innovation Grant. 4 SMEs have received funding where they are doing work with environmental and social returns, so we can actually look at how the returns are being augmented through additional technical assistance. And finally, we are launching in March an enhanced monitoring and evaluation system that will provide impact results. And our goal here is to create a streamlined system that can sit alongside the usual reporting. Much of this will be quantitative indicators that we'll ask SME and funds to report on. For example, Sirona already requires that all of its funds and SMEs report on 33 non-financial indicators that are in the IRIS catalog. And we would like to add to that, because many of the indicators, as some of you are aware, in the IRIS catalog are output. Does this company have an environmental policy? Well, we want to know not only does it have a policy, is it implementing the policy? And if it is implementing the policy, what impact does that have on the environment, on the employees, on the communities in which it works? And in order to achieve that, we've put together a committee of very high-profile people who are concerned about impact measurement in international investment. We have representatives from the GIN, from UNPRI, from DFAT-D, from Mars, from Sirona, from a developing country fund, from a developing country investee, and so on. And we are all working together to come up with a streamlined set of impact indicators that go beyond the usual outputs. I think this is a good model, one that Canadian DFI could build on. And I think that our Canadian DFI will and needs to build on such experience to support private sector development and to ensure that we have an impactful nexus between development and investment. Thank you.
Great. So I'd like to thank our three speakers, Gerhard, Brett, and Linda. Those were some excellent presentations. Clearly, a lot of food for thought, and you'll see that there are differences between the three presentations around not only the choices we're making, but also the purpose of what we're trying to get at and how we'll measure success. We heard from Brett around some of the choices we have to consider, the design considerations, and I think the points you laid out were very clear around how we consider some of these factors when we think about the discussion that we're about to have. Gerhard, you initially posed the question of whether we should even do this, but I think more accurately said that if we're going to do this, let's be very clear about what and why, and then let's look at being catalytic. And Linda, you just talked a little bit about the link between economic growth and development outcomes, how we are additive and complementary, but also looking at how we match some of the existing activity to what we're planning to talk about right now. So there's some agreement around creating an institution that matches purpose, as Brett pointed out, the ability to be catalytic and not crowd out private investment, as several of the speakers talked about, the need to be additive in terms of there's a range of activity that's already happening, and to learn from not only the experience of others, but the experience of the people around the room. And so that's where we're going to jump in. We're going to take questions from around the room as well as online, and so I'm going to open it up. I'm going to ask you, if you have a question, please speak into the mic, introduce yourself very quickly with your name, and keep your question brief because we have, I think, a lot to get through. So I'll open it up now, and I'll ask you to pose the question to one or more of the speakers, and I'll ask them to respond accordingly. So I'll open it up now. And we have questions coming in online as well, I believe. So, yes.
Thank you. My name is Dominic Schofield, and I'm with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Good morning, and first to congratulate the speakers, really interesting presentations, and of course the Aga Khan Foundation as well for hosting this meeting. I'm wondering if, and this is not directed to any one of the presenters, but I'm wondering if the presenters could also reflect a little bit on the requirement or the opportunity for flexibility in instruments for financing. What we found in our own work, exploring a range of different mechanisms to either engage with the private sector or release, attract private capital, was that flexibility in context is really, really important. In some cases, technical assistance is really what narrowed that risk gap. In other cases, it was risk-taking finance. But in many cases, it was a blend not only of different forms of capital, but also a blend that would evolve over time. There's a temporal dimension to it. So as we talk about DFIs, I think about a very rigid structure. We've got partnerships with IFC and others. How would flexibility play a role in the solution?
I think Gerhard, maybe this is a question that you could provide a perspective on, and Brett and Linda, if you want to. And I just ask you to come up here just because we're recording this. So.
I think we all mentioned that a DFI or a development mechanism or something, development finance, has to be willing to take risks, be creative, be courageous. And flexibility is certainly part of that. The more rigid we create anything, the less adaptable it is by definition. No, I totally agree with you. And that's where the marriage of capital that requires a certain return, whether it's through a DFI or private sector, whatever, with perhaps some guarantee mechanism or concessionary capital, perhaps some technical assistance. Different situations require different responses. All of that is an attempt to meet a certain need on the ground and eventually to close that gap. And so I agree with you. We need flexibility. Yeah.
Just building on Gerhard's comments, I think the notion of TA, technical assistance, is something worth considering in terms of how it's delivered. In some cases, DFIs deliver it themselves. In some cases, they deliver it through partner organizations. Something we may wish to think about is how broad a mandate we wish to give whatever development finance mechanism or institution is set up. In some ways, technical assistance can best be provided by that provider of finance. Arguably, though, that muddies its mandate and its remit, and that may be work that's better done by DFAT-D, by NGOs, by private financial institutions. There's no necessity, I think, to have all of these things under one roof. We need to think clearly about whether that enhances the effectiveness of technical assistance or other aspects of the flexibility we're looking for, or reduces it. And I think there are good arguments on both sides that we can learn from.
Great, thanks. I'll take one more question here, and then we've got an online question. So,
yeah, I'd like to hear from each of the three speakers on, a lot of people have been talking about fixing the gap. So I'd like to get a better sense from each of them of what the gap is that they feel is being filled, because I got a sense from each of the presentations that it was a very different gap. The last speaker, I think, talked about a gap really in credit-constrained markets, high-risk markets for local small and medium-sized enterprises, demonstrating tangible development and monitorable impacts. Some of the other speakers, I think, were talking about finance more for Canadian companies in emerging markets in middle-income countries. And I think you're going to have a very different institute based on that. Mm-hmm. And I think the experience of European DFIs is that they have largely benefited companies from OECD countries. A lot of financial intermediaries, 50% of the funding goes to financial intermediaries. A number of these companies are based in secrecy jurisdictions. So, what's the gap that's being filled?
Okay. So maybe I'll ask Linda to start, and then Brett and Gerhard, you come up. So I think this both is around the gap, but you're also asking about really what the purpose, to reaffirm what the purpose of a DFI could be. So.
Yeah, actually, I agree with my two colleagues that the gap is lack of private investment, and therefore DFI needs to be catalytic, and that is the gap it's trying to fill. But if we are putting development dollars into that, then I think we need to make sure that there are development results, that we're not just facilitating private equity markets willy-nilly, but with a focus on how we're developing them. When I use the term SME, though, I just want to clarify here, I'm not talking about necessarily very small businesses. The program that we're partnering with Sirona on, the average investment in the SME is about $2.5 to $3 million, I believe. The ultimate investment in the SME average is around $2.5 million. However, MEDA as a development organization is very interested in the missing middle, so I think this is something that it would be interesting to support the closure of. The missing middle is above microfinance and below what appears to be the kind of the lowest level for many financial institutions, investment institutions, around $2 million. So between $20,000 and $2 million ticket price. But I'm not saying that's the only thing that a DFI needs to do. I mean, I think a DFI can invest in large SMEs and do a very good job of creating formal jobs for people, decent jobs with good benefits, can contribute to the local tax base. But I just think we need to understand if that's what we're doing, what are we achieving? So I'm actually in agreement with them, but with some caveats.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I too would echo some of what was just said by saying I think there's some broad agreement here. The risk premium that is demanded by private finance and the actual underlying risk have a gap between them. That assessment is the gap that I think we need to try to fill. And I think that gap applies very broadly in a wide range of situations. It applies in situations where returns from an investment are heavily backloaded, where it may take 5 to 10 years, say, before you start seeing substantial yield from an investment. It may be in cases where we're looking to leverage diaspora communities in Canada who have substantial relationships to their original or home countries. And because they're relatively newly established here, because they're proposing to do work that is relatively new to the Canadian marketplace, they're not able to get financing either in Canada or elsewhere because of lack of a credit record or a lack of a substantial business history to finance what would otherwise be high-yielding projects. It also applies to new sectors, to new industries, to new products that don't have a great history behind them or any history at all. And I think it also applies to very traditional projects where the macroeconomic or the geopolitical assessment of risks by the private sector remains out of tune with the real risks on the ground. I think sub-Saharan Africa is a case where this has persisted for a great deal of time, where over the last 20 years you've seen the highest macro growth rates and some of the best macro fundamentals of any region in the world, and yet it's only in the last few years that you've started seeing substantial investment flows into sub-Saharan Africa from North America, perhaps, for instance, I should say. Over that time, you saw a much quicker appreciation of the collapse in the difference between risk premia and actual risks by European investors, where you're seeing much greater flows. And what you see, I think, is a distinction in risk assessment that comes out of familiarity and proximity that a Canadian DFI could help shrink.
I agree. Good question, and I echo what Linda and Brett have said as well. I may have misspoken or been misunderstood. I wasn't suggesting that a DFI or development finance invest in Canadian companies to do mining in Peru. Maybe that's appropriate as well. I don't know. I'm not in that industry. I was talking about a gap of financing for SMEs, for small to mid-market companies in Kenya, in Zaire, in wherever. And how do you fill that gap? The IFC has done a study that showed that the companies, the small to mid-market companies that they've invested in through their portfolio funds have a debt-to-equity ratio of about 1/3 of equivalent-sized companies in the United States. There's a constraint of capital in many of these markets. There's a surplus of capital over here. How do we get that capital from over here to over there? And that is to invest with care and intent. Any kind of development finance mechanism or development finance institution or something needs to be aware of and targeted to make sure that it enhances the social and environmental outcomes of the populations in those developing countries. So I'm not talking about a gap here in Canada, I'm talking about a gap on the ground for job creation, for social and environmental outcomes in those countries.
So we're just going to take a question online, and then I'll get back to the room. So the question was, most presentations have focused on the SME and side of things, but do you think a DFM, or I guess a DFI, would find a niche to support social infrastructure investments through a public-private partnership lens? So the example here was a river microhydro project for remote communities. It's an interesting question. Yesterday with Tessa Hebb at Carleton University, we hosted a full-day session around sustainable infrastructure and how you get the largest institutional investors in this country and the pension funds engaged in impact investing. Again, maybe I'll pose it to any one of the presenters that want to come up. Is there a role for a DFM in supporting social infrastructure investments through public-private partnerships, knowing that we have different variations of these models already? So I don't know, Brett or Linda, if you want to come up.
Well, I think the social infrastructure of the sort that's being mentioned in the question is absolutely within the remit of a potential DFI. It also speaks to a range of possible delivery methods or mechanisms for a DFI. I spoke a bit about a Crown Corporation or a subsidiary of existing Crown Corporation or a unit of government. One other option on the slide, but that I didn't emphasize so much verbally, is the notion of a public-private partnership to actually be the DFI, a consortium of Canadian finance institutions that are essentially providing all of the back office infrastructure and the lending and analysis mechanisms, based on a pool of capital that's been de-risked, where the first risk tranche is being taken by the Canadian government, would also be a way of delivering this and would be closely aligned with that kind of investment in the developing countries we want to focus on.
I might add, it seems pretty simple that if there is something that wants to get done, and we determine that it's good to have that done, but there's a dearth of capital for it, then some kind of development mechanism ought to be supporting that. We also invest in renewable energy, wind, micro hydro, and run-of-the-river hydro, and things like that. I think those are, and infrastructure. I can imagine building a road from here, a new highway from here to Toronto doesn't have a whole lot of positive social impact. Building a highway from Lusaka out to the countryside allows hundreds of villagers to get their product to a market. And so that may have great social impact. And so yes, wherever there is capital deficit, and we determine that it's socially beneficial, we want to support that, then a DFI or DFM or whatever it is called has its place.
Great, I'll take some questions from the room now. I think we had one here, and then we'll take a couple more before we wrap up. So, please.
Hi, thank you so much to the AGACON Foundation for hosting this morning. Really appreciate it. Ailish Campbell from the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. The CCCE represents the 150 largest market cap companies in Canada at the CEO level. We also host a CEO forum with India. So I have a rather specific question. And it really relates to what I see as the value proposition of a development finance institution. From the private sector's perspective, capital has many options right now. We even have an infrastructure deficit in our own country, which we hear about repeatedly from all levels of government, as well as near and advanced markets with very low risk profiles. So to my mind, the value proposition I wanted to test with our experts this morning is, of course, a DFI that does attract capital through buying down risk. And that means it goes further out on the risk profile, and of course also meets a need. And the government does have the advantage, I would say, of also partnering in countries where it sees that there's a local relationship, a foreign policy relationship to develop, frankly. So thinking about India, where I see the value of this is particularly at scale. And by that, I mean incredibly large projects in the infrastructure space, in the sanitation space, in the mass transit space, water treatment, for example, where we've seen great success with other in other nations. And again, where I see the value proposition as being bringing in expertise and a consortia approach of SMEs and large Canadian companies. So my question is really this: are we ready to do big things with this potential organization and institution? And by that, I don't mean a whole bunch of small projects, but I mean potentially one or two very big things that also increases Canada's profile and developmental expertise in some incredibly significant markets. And again, I would point to India, where I know we have great private sector interest, but where the risk profile is significant, and the government would be a very welcome partner. Interested in
Great question,
views.
and I think a good build on from the prior one. So maybe, I know all three probably want to have a crack at it. I'll ask Linda maybe to start, and then Brett and Gerhard, please step up.
Well, yeah, India, it's an interesting case. India is a case unto itself. Everything that happens in India seems to happen in a big way, like microfinance, for example. And are we ready for those big challenges? I think we have to be ready. When I look at India, and I think this is a really good example where philanthropy is, trying to take off. Gates has gone over there to, talk to philanthropists and trying to get it off the ground. India's a middle-income country. 28% of the population, if you do a multidimensional poverty analysis, are destitute. 28%. So we have huge issues there. Can investment in infrastructure help solve some of those problems? Absolutely. Because destitution means people do not have access to latrines, for example. People do not have access to running water. People do not have access to electricity. So infrastructure projects can do a lot to improve the lives of the people who are living in destitution in a country like India. And I think now that Canada is on the leading edge of innovative finance, at least in our own minds, I think it's the time to grab it and run with it. I really do. And I think there's enough energy. And I think the energy's there from private sector people I've talked to. There's a lot of energy from foundations. I think foundations are interesting because foundations, a lot of them have endowments, and they're using those endowments to fund programming, but now they're beginning to look at where their endowments are actually invested. So there's kind of a potential double hit with working with foundations. So I think there's a lot of energy across a lot of constituencies, and I think this could also be something very Canadian. You know, we're a big country. We've got a Trans-Canada Railway. We've got, you know, massive resources, but also in terms of creating electricity. So, you know, thinking about those kinds of big things, I think would be very Canadian as well.
This is one of these fantastically warm Q&A sessions where you get to echo and build on everyone who comes before you. So saying that, I think this points to a critical issue on what Canada should be thinking about more broadly and the DFI should be focused on. You know, I have taught a number of undergraduates and continue to mentor them who are super interested in social enterprise and doing things like delivering solar-powered lights or little generators to villages in places like India. What I'd rather see Canada doing is helping the Indian government get the grid all the way to those villages, rather than stopgap measures like those wonderful solar generators, but let's have really much deeper impact on the scale that I think your question is pointing toward. That's where we have expertise that we can leverage. That's where we can also free up ODA for the other countries I mentioned that are in black on my slide earlier, and others not even on that grid. To do so, though, at scale, we've got to be ready for some failure. The average private equity firm gets success with somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 investments it makes. We have to be upfront about the fact that some of these investments aren't going to work out in varying degrees or another, and recognize that our assessment of the success of a DFI will not wholly be based on, do we get 100% follow through on the yields that we're expecting on every project. I think in order to insulate the political side on that, we engage the private sector in that risk analysis in a fundamental way. Not only because that is useful optically when things don't work out, it's also drawing on the expertise that we have, which is probably much greater than we have in the public sector. Lastly, I would say one of the big attractions of that kind of scale is that it could generate the returns that might allow us, through dividends out of an eventual DFI or DFM, cross-subsidize ODA and increase our ODA footprint at the same time. That would be a wonderful story. If extending the grid in India allowed us to start providing solar panels in Niger, I think that's a wonderful case of win-win being generated by this.
And finally, I'll also agree. We invest in companies that have an enterprise value of up to $150 million. So that's pretty small. Hani Assad, just over here, he invests in companies that are slightly larger than our sweet spot, also in frontier and emerging markets. Without those that are investing in the large cap companies, without a public sector, a publicly traded market, we're not making investments. We have to have exits out to those other companies. And without really robust, strong infrastructure, I agree. I mean, with some of the best things that can happen in India, we're investing in a couple of electrical grid companies in India, small ones. But until India and many of those other countries get energy out to the villages around the country, and that's some pretty big projects, a lot of the small-scale development, business development, ain't going to happen. So I agree.
The bad news is I'm going to have to cut this discussion short. The good news is that we do have 2 more sessions coming up where we'll get a chance to deepen some of the conversations that have been started. And we will be posting the presentations online, and we'll have the opportunity to hopefully respond to some of the questions we weren't able to address, especially from our web audience in that forum. So we will take a 15-minute break right now. We will reconvene at 11 for the first of the two roundtables. I would like to thank our web audience, who will now be leaving us, or we will be leaving them, I guess. And I look forward to continuing the discussion in a few minutes. And thank you very much to Kareem, Brett, Gerhard, and Linda for kicking us off with very stimulating presentations that will lead to many more interesting discussions.